Hey, this is Donald from Padlock Technologies, owner and principal, here to talk about another advanced topic in Cisco Identity Services Engine. We're going to talk about posturing. Now, posturing, I like to call, there's two type of enforcement levels that I like to talk about. So there's level 1 enforcement and then there's level 2 enforcement. Level 1 enforcement is your basic stuff, wired, wireless, profiling, maybe DACO and VLAN separation, right? Simple stuff. And I always say people need to get basic level 1 enforcement in their environment before they tackle level 2 enforcement, which is now posturing and TrustSec. I did a TrustSec video already. Now we're going to talk about posturing. These are things that get laid on top of level 1 enforcement. So the assumption is level 1 enforcement is there. So now let's talk about posturing and the point of posturing and the booby traps of posturing. So what posturing is a technique that will look at the certain criteria, or like I would like to say device, you can say device health, or just say criteria. And I always spell that word wrong. So criteria, right? So what are some of the things you can look at? You can look at, is the firewall on? Something simple as that. You can look at, are they up to date from a system patch, update system, or AVAM, which is anti-malware, antivirus, or you can look at, there's a whole bunch of things you could technically look at. I'll leave these two, and these are called conditions, right? These are conditions that you would look at on the device. You can actually look for certain files on the network. Files on the device to identify it as a managed machine. Now, nobody really does this if you're using certificate-based authentication, because if you have a certificate on your machine that I'm using to authenticate, chances are you are your company's managed machine. There's no need to do certificate-based authentication and then do something like, oh, I want to do a posture check for this certificate to make sure it's a managed machine. You've already done that in the authentication stage. So you don't need to actually do that. You don't need to do that again. You can do something, most people don't do this, but you can do something for app visibility, right? So what app visibility is when I'm going to scan your machine, and then I'm going to see everything that's running and installed on the network, or on your device, not network. I don't know why I keep saying network, but on your device. Now you could probably make some rules to determine, say, hey, if I don't want this on the machine, I see it on your machine, I need to uninstall it. Or I can use my MDM to uninstall it, right? I'll create a rule in my MDM that says this app is not allowed. So ultimately, how this functions is basically how ICE functions as well. There are conditions that you want to match. There is optional remediations. And when I say optional, because not everything is automatic, and you may not want to do any automatic remediations, and you probably don't want to do manual remediations because the user may not have administrative access to actually make any changes to their machine. So that's why I say they're optional. Now, under that remediation category is this thing called requirements. And your requirements basically say, if the condition happens, then do something, right? And if you have an automated remediation, then it'll do this. And underneath that, there's also one called message only, which basically says display this text message if they do not meet this condition. And then you have the posture policy. All right? You have a posture policy, which basically grabs the condition, and then you have three categories of you either make it mandatory, so they have to pass it. You make it optional, which most people do not do because they want to make it mandatory. And then they have this thing called an audit. So audit is basically a monitoring mode type of thing, right? Which falls into play with the application visibility, because your application visibility requirement is going to fall under an audit policy, so you can just check what's on the machine. Most people don't do that. Now, there is a fourth Fourth thing in posturing, which is the CP or client provisioning. Right now, most people, I'm going to tell you right now, you do not want to do client provisioning. You can have it. That's fine. It's a part of the process, but you do not want users going through the posture installation process. It is very cumbersome, and most users will just give up after a while because they have to go to a website, in ICE, then they have to download the module, DM, download the module, not direct message, just as an Instagram, by the way. After that, they have to install the module. Then they have to run the module. Then they have to get the posture status, or ICE will get the posture status. Then they will get on the network if they're compliant. So everything in here, the user is going to have to do, right? The likelihood of the user wanting to do that, the likelihood of a C-suite person wanting to do that and going through that is slim to none. So it's better if you have like MDM or if your IT desktop team, just install the module on people's computer, put the posture profile on there, and just leave them out of the equation as much as possible. Leave the user out of the equation. So where do people get tripped up on this? Well, I kind of already mentioned it, right? So you have a couple posture status. So posture status, right? First one, very easy, is posture unknown, right? If ICE doesn't know the posture of the machine, it usually kicks them into, which is that whole thing, go to the website, blah, 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 download it. If that's already on there, then it'll just run the scan, right? It will run scan to get the posture of the device. The next one is posture non-compliant. And this is something that's going to happen when device doesn't uh, doesn't clear the posture check. So basically what that's saying is, hey, I have certain things that are mandatory. You failed it. What are we going to do with this, right? And I'm going to get back to that one. And this should be 2, not 1. And then 3, posture compliance. So this is basically posture was successful based on the policy that you created, and they're allowed on the network. Devices allowed on the network. On network. Now you can also couple this with TrustSec as well. It's not either or. Like you can apply it SGT at the posture compliance level and just say, okay, all right, once they get on the network, they get this SGT, and then my TrustSec policy does the enforcement for me at my enforcement points. You could, I don't, I don't tell people to do this, and I don't make this as a recommendation as well. But you can also do TrustSec at these levels. You can have an SGT for unknown machines, and you have an SGT for non-compliant machines. I don't really suggest you doing that though. Most people don't, but you could. Now, what are the most obvious ones, the easiest ones to do something with? Well, it is posture unknown because they're just going to go to the redirect, and then there's posture compliant because they successfully passed your posture policy and they're on your network. Where everybody gets burned, and I've asked this question at least 2,000 times because I've done this a lot. Where people get burned is posture non-compliant. Because this is basically, what are you going to do if they don't pass posture? Nobody ever thinks of that. Or at least the people that I have did consulting for or did projects for, every time I say, okay, We know what they're going to do when they're compliant. We know what they're going to do when they're unknown. What are they going to do when they don't pass your posture policy? What are you going to do about it? Where do you want them to go? And they pause and say, I haven't really thought about that. So then we go down the rabbit hole there. Well, there's a couple things that you can do. You can minimize access, which is if it's it depends on your posture conditions, and that's the next thing that's you're going to get tripped up on. You can minimize access, meaning you can just say you get HTTP and HTTPS to get updates. You can do a remediation VLAN, which I do not suggest people do, but some people, for their security policy, they want to do that. So you put them in a security VLAN and then you give them the same minimized access. You don't need to do that per se, but if that's your security policy, so be it. There's a myriad of things basically you can do for non-compliance. So you need to think about what happens if someone does not pass my security policy, my posture policy. What am I going to do about that? That's the conversation you need to have internally every time. It's because the other two are fairly easy, right? They're compliant, they're going to get on the network, they're posture unknown, they're going to go do the posture check. But if they're not compliant, what are we going to do? So I would think about that one first, because the other two are fairly simple. The other place where people get burned at is, this is a big one, what do you want to check? That's another question that people get burned on. When I ask them, okay, we're going to do posturing, what would you like to check in your posture policy? It's almost like they never thought about that. And they're like, they either do one or two things. They just flat out tell me they don't know, which is we don't know. Or they say, what have you seen in the industry? So both of these questions are bad, but one is a little bit better than the other. We don't know is bad. If you're trying to implement something into your network, there needs to be a reason why you're implementing it into the network, and then you need to know what you actually want to check in your network or on your network devices or on the supplicants. If you are just like, I want to implement posturing and you haven't even thought about, hey, what do we actually want to check? Posturing, you just need to stop immediately. Let's go back to the drawing board and you start with the basic. What do we actually want to check on the supplicant, or which is the laptop? What do we want to check? Because this is going to indicate your posture conditions. Now, these conditions, as long as it can be done in ICE, we can do it, right? The stuff that you want to check for, as long as ICE can check for it, then you can make a posture condition for it. But if you don't even know what you want to check, posturing is a little bit farther than you thought it was, right? To implement into your network. The other one, which is what have you seen in the industry? That's a good question. Still bad, but it's better than we don't know. But I always come back and say, well, what is your security policy? Because what you see in the industry, what works for one person, it may violate your security policy. So I can't go off of what somebody else is doing and apply it to you. Because what they're doing might not, from a security policy perspective, may not mesh with what you are doing from a security policy perspective. And now you're implementing something that goes against your security policy for posture, which is already, you're in the red already, right? So the question I always come back with is, what is your security policy? And I either get one or two things. We don't know, which goes back to this one. We don't know, or this is even worse. We don't have a security policy. A CSP, a security policy. We don't have a security policy, which is even worse because I don't say this to clients, but in the back of my head, I'm like, so what are you implementing ICE for if you don't have a security policy? Because your NAC deployment should be based on your security policy. You should have thought about, hey, ultimately, what does our security policy say so that we can make sure our NAC environment actually implements what our security policy says, and we're not just winging it, aka bottom up management, bottom up versus top down, right? Top down comes from this, there's a policy, and then everything goes down to final implementation. Bottom up is we just implement it, and then we're trying to fix it through policy after we see like the fires that we need to put out, which is just bad management altogether. But this, what you're seeing here, is why I say, are you ready? I'll say things like, are you ready for posture? Are you ready for TrustSec? Because these type of enforcement models actually require you to really think about what are you trying to do from a security policy perspective through NAC. And if you haven't thought about that, I wouldn't just run to level 2 enforcement, which posture and TrustSec and implementing MDM to do MDM checks. I wouldn't run to any of that until one, I have my basic level 1 enforcement, wired, wireless, VPN domain, all that stuff, tuned in, locked in, your profiling, tuned in, locked in. You have a method of, profiling devices and stuff like that. Once that's all tuned in, now the next higher level conversation is, okay, I want to implement posture. I want to implement TrustSec. Let's talk about what that looks like before we implement it. Let's talk about what we're trying to do from a policy perspective in our NAC implementation so that there's some synergy between what's written in a policy document and then what's configured in ICE. If you are somebody that is ready for level 2 enforcement, even level 1 enforcement, like you just bought ICE, you kind of don't know what to do with it and you need help getting level 1 up, I can help you with that, right? I'll leave a link in the description for a discovery call to see where you are and then talk about where you want to go and then how to get there. That link is going to be in the description. Hopefully, we can get a project we can work together. If not, at least I'll point you in the right direction on what you need to do and we walk away as friends. Again, this is Don from Padlock Technologies talking about posturing and if you even need posturing in your network right now. Hopefully this video was informative. Thank you and have a nice day.